just want to start with a couple of informal things. First of all, I would like to very much thank Victor and all the organizers for inviting me to do this. It's really exciting. It's a great opportunity and it's a thrilling conference. And I have to say that corresponding with Victor in getting everything set up and ready to go has been a pleasure. A really entertaining exchange. Victor is smart and witty, so it's really been fun in the lead up to this. I will also mention, and this is the unfortunate part, I am in the middle of some pretty horrifying oral surgery woes that have come to a climax this very week and this very couple of days. And this is going to severely curtail my participation in the conference after this very opening session. And I really deeply regret that. At this moment, I have a prosthesis in my mouth, which I hope my tongue doesn't trip over too much. But a little bit later today, things go into high gear. So I really regret that I won't be here for much of the conference. But it's a very exciting event, and I look forward to catching up with anything I miss, both in print and in the YouTube channel and so forth. So just get that out of the way. So now, again, without further ado, because time is limited, I would like to get started. I will mention that, of course, I'll be going like this a lot to indicate that I'm quoting, and I'm not always, every single time, going to indicate the source of a quote. Sometimes I'm just sort of quoting. Some people have summarized something, and it's not really opinion material, and people like Michael Witt and Celine Samama and Giles Felka and Ivan Saracina, I won't mention them by name. I don't want to slow things down, but I will still be quoting a lot of people and attributing a lot of quotes, so I just want to mention that for the record. Of course, in the printed version of this, all the endnotes and everything will be there. So again, my presentation is in fact called Haunted by Godard, and I will now launch into it. Jean-Luc Godard was, oh, one more thing, my French pronunciation is awful. So I will be using a lot of English language titles. Usually I'll try to mention a French title at the beginning and then switch to English. Also, I really am always sensitive to the fact that there are sometimes people who are present in a conference session who are newcomers or not really well versed in the material. They're here because they're exploring, not because they're already immersed in the material. So I will occasionally do a little synopsizing of plots and that sort of thing, some basic material, just in case there's anybody here who's not really familiar with this. For everybody else, I hope it will just be a little reminder, refresh memories. Okay, Haunted by Godard. Jean-Luc Godard was haunted by cinema. In his early films, he rebelled against genres that had long loomed within his thinking, as in the romantic melodrama Le Mépris, where ancient literature and a venerable filmmaker represent the tenacious shades of traditional narrative, whose confines he was eager to escape. The haunting takes a theological form in Je vous salue Marie, where engagements with the soul and the divine manifest Godard's quasi-spiritual faith in painterly and cinematic images. And in Histoire du Cinéma, he conjures up cinema's ghostly lineage by means of images translated from the crisp materiality of film to the pliant inexactitude of video. I have chosen these three masterpieces, Contempt from 1963, Hail Mary from 1985, and Histoire du Cinéma, completed in 1999, to propose hauntology as a useful tool for illuminating Godard's body of work. As posited by Jacques Derrida, hauntology displaces ontology, figuring the specter as an unfathomable intruder that is, in the words of philosopher Colin Davis, neither present nor absent, neither dead nor alive, a state resembling cinema's dual nature, both imminently present and physically ungraspable. Another sense of the term, developed in psychoanalytic theory, emphasizes the phantom, the metaphorical presence of what Davis describes as a dead ancestor in the living ego, still intent on preventing its traumatic and usually shameful secrets from coming to light. This is an entity pertinent to Godard's fear of an end of cinema, wrought by capitalist exploitation and political cowardice. Speculating along similar lines, Frederick Jameson posits spectrality as an awareness that the living present is scarcely as self-sufficient as it claims to be, and that we would do well not to count on its density and solidity. This is another concept pertinent to Godard's anxieties about cinema's convoluted past, living present, and threatened future. In its revolutionary reworking of film history, Godard's project exemplifies Derrida's idea of an interpretation that transforms what it interprets. Godard was haunted by cinema. Cinema remains haunted by Godard. A major reference point for Derrida's hauntology is Hamlet's complaint that time is out of joint. According to philosopher Liam Sprad, it is through temporal displacement that the past invades or haunts the present with its return, and in this disjuncture makes possible a new aesthetic that is hauntology. This aesthetic is marked by a return of the ideas, images, and ideals of a past age, which now grate and creak against the joints of the present. This suggests an interesting entryway to Godard's filmography, beginning with his earliest titles. These are very different from the pictures he made in later years, but although they are narrative movies with relatively straightforward structures, they offer clear signs that he was already haunted by film history, stalked by the spirits of traditional genres that he set about deconstructing and reconfiguring in what could almost have been a systematically charted program. Breathless reshapes the romantic melodrama. Infâme est une femme does the same with the musical comedy. Vivre sa vie takes on urban docudrama. Le Petit Soldat is a secret agent story, Les Carabiniers a war picture, Bande à part a gangster film, Alphaville a science fiction fantasy, Pierrot le Fou a lovers on the run adventure, Weekend a road movie, and Masculine Féminin and La Chinoise give absurdist twists to the youth market trend that swept through cinema in the 60s era, and so on. In each case, Godard invokes, materializes, and perhaps exorcises a particular set of spirits from cinema's past. The success of the exorcism is signaled by his willingness and ability to stop operating along these lines at the end of the 1960s, making the break that brought about the aesthetic radicalism of 1+1 and Le Gai Savoir, then the political aesthetic radicalism of the Dziga Vertov group films, and then the decades-long avant-gardism of pretty much every work he created until the Image Book closed his career in 2018. Each film and video evinces a hyper-real present, haunted by a visionary past. His palimpsests take many different forms, from the generic revisionism of the early years to the multifaceted tapestries of Histoire du Cinéma and the three-dimensional kinetics of goodbye to language. But they always reveal shades of the rekindled past, grating and creaking against joints of the inescapable present. No early film better expresses Godard's fascination with spirits of the departed than his sixth feature, Le Mépris, based on Alberto Moravia's 1954 novel Il Disprezzo, known as A Ghost of Noon in its English translation. This was almost literally a haunted project, created only a few years after Godard's mother died in a Swiss traffic accident, making a bitter and long-lasting impression on the second oldest of her four children, then in his middle 20s. I synopsized the film in a 2001 essay. Contempt centers on Paul Javal, a French screenwriter who agrees to rewrite the screenplay of an Italian film production based on the Odyssey in order to pay for the Rome apartment where he and his wife want to settle down. Paul is troubled by taking a motion picture assignment since he sees himself as a serious writer, more attuned to high-flown theater than to lowbrow movies. His intellectual side is soothed by the idea of working with legendary German filmmaker Fritz Lang, played in Contempt by Lang himself, one of Godard's longtime heroes. But he also has to work with Jerry Prokosch, a Hollywood producer who is less interested in Homeric poetry than in the naked women he gets to ogle when viewing the daily rushes. Jerry is instantly smitten with Paul's wife, Camille, and flirts with her from their first moments together. When he invites the couple for a drink in his villa, Paul unhesitatingly agrees to let Camille ride in Jerry's two-passenger roadster while he finds a taxi for the trip. Camille takes this as a sign of Paul's decreasing commitment to their marriage. She gathers that he is indulging the producer's lust as a way of currying his favor, and begins revealing her own anxieties and insecurities about their future. The situation grows more complicated as it proceeds, especially when the threesome move to an exotic villa on Capri, where the Odyssey production is being filmed. Camille endures and even encourages Jerry's continuing flirtation. Paul shows a casual romantic interest in Jerry's attractive assistant, and Lang maintains a philosophical air while trying to keep his movie on a reasonably high plane, despite Jerry's crassly commercial interventions. At one point, Paul places a loaded pistol into his pocket, clearly intended for use on Jerry and/or Camille if her growing contempt for him, hence the film's title, erupts into a full-fledged refutation of their marriage. But fate intervenes before he can fire it, assuming that he could actually have brought himself to do so. Camille leaves Paul for a new life with Jerry. The producer's luxurious Alfa Romeo is crushed in a crash that kills him and Camille instantly, and Paul prepares for his departure from Capri as Lang films a sweeping seaside shot that concludes Contempt on a note of intricately blended lyricism, melancholy, and resignation. Contempt contains a host of ghostly presences, and many are linked to practices of traditional narrative, practices that Godard wrestled with as fiercely as Jacob wrestles with an angel in the book of Genesis, an incident wittily reprised by Godard in Passion, the story of a Godard-like filmmaker who can't bring himself to tell a story. The most concrete of the ghostly presences is Fritz Lang, triply figured as an actor, a character, and an icon of classical cinematic practice whose days as an active director are now behind him. The most abstract of the presences is the spirit of Homeric epic, a template for narrative art of every subsequent millennium. Although the Lang of Germany and Hollywood never essayed an adaptation of Homer, the Lang of Contempt has taken on the challenge, and so has his money-minded producer, evidently thinking of the profits racked up by Italy's long string of Hercules peplums, which were still being cranked out when Contempt was released. Contempt itself has clear Homeric echoes, frequently mentioning the Odyssey, vividly depicting Greek statuary, draping Paul in a sheet resembling a toga, and building to a climax with a deus ex machina twist, abruptly killing two of the film's main characters. Although some critics have attacked the deus ex machina device as arbitrary and outmoded, it is utterly appropriate in a film that makes continual reference to ancient Greek culture and is profoundly rooted in ideas of fate, destiny, and the mysterious power of godlike figures. Godard does not show the smash-up that kills Camille and Jerry, but he does show their corpses in its aftermath, and the tableau is silent and still, a scene of horror rendered paradoxically peaceful by the precision of Godard's mise-en-scène, the gentle motions of Raoul Coutard's camera, and the calming texture of Georges Delarue's music. The deus who presides here is Thanatos, identified by psychoanalysis as the unconscious drive toward impassivity, stasis, and the death that terminates all sorrows and strivings. This god governs the climax and also haunts the denouement, where Godard and Lang are both shooting their final scenes. Lang's camera is filming a sword-wielding actor, and Godard's camera films Lang's camera with the same lateral movement. But then its motion carries beyond the ostensible subject of the shot, leaving behind the human figures and embracing the sun-struck waters of the sea, as Lang's assistant, played by Godard, calls out the film's last word, silence, recalling another line from Hamlet, the prince's own last words, the rest is silence. And Victor, let's show a clip here from Contempt.
On a téléphoné de Rome, ils sont morts. Alors, au revoir.
Rosella, il copione.
N'oublie pas les cartes, Carolus.
Monsieur Lang, je viens vous dire au revoir.
Au revoir. Qu'est-ce que vous ferez?
Le point.
Je vais retourner à Rome.
Il fuoco.
Je vais finir d'écrire ma pièce de théâtre.
Bon.
Et vous?
Je termine le film. Il faut toujours terminer qu'est-ce qu'on a commencé.
Quel plan vous faites, là?
Le premier regard d'Ulysse quand il revoit sa patrie.
Ulysse.
Ulysse.
Ithaque.
Alors,
Au revoir, monsieur Lang.
au revoir. À bientôt, j'espère.
Ulysse vers la mer.
Ulysse verso il mare.
Monsieur Lang, on est prêt.
Merci.
Silence, on tourne.
Silenzio si gira. Silenzio. Camera.
Moteur.
Motore. Partito.
Jack.
Odissea 14.702 prima.
Avanti.
Azione.
Travelling.
Carello.
Silenzio.
Yeah, thank you. Simultaneously filling the screen with plenitude and emptying it of detail, the sea here becomes a specter in one of Derrida's most interesting senses, representing what one imagines, what one thinks one sees, and which one projects on an imaginary screen where there is nothing to see. Like the end of Michael Snow's Wavelength, the end of Contempt shows practically nothing and almost everything, rendering pictorial reality as both visually present and materially unreachable. Like Derrida's specter in Davis's words, the sea presents a deconstructive figure hovering between life and death, presence and absence, and making established certainties vacillate. Established certainties are among Godard's greatest adversaries, and one of his chief weapons against them is the dislocation of time. Contempt is one of cinema's preeminent architectural achievements, moving through a series of visually distinctive locations, and its ostensibly linear chronology is no less complex, most conspicuously on 3 occasions when the narrative is interrupted by flurries of flashback or flash-forward shots that serve less to flesh out the narrative than to offer moments of rhythmic punctuation and poetic reflection. More broadly, Contempt educes a heroically vast time span, encompassing the legacies of Homeric epic, the exigencies of classical cinema, represented by the real and fictional Lang, and the innovations of the Nouvelle Vague, in which Godard played a formative role. Dynamics related to these animate Hail Mary, a work haunted not by a small g god of antiquity, but by the capital G god of Christianity, the religion in which Godard was raised. He has said that although he didn't practice the Protestant religiosity he was brought up on, he was very interested in certain areas of Roman Catholic thought, and a starting point for Hail Mary was his impulse to counterpose Catholic images and Protestant music in contrapuntal dialogue. "I'm not a religious person," he remarked, "but I'm a faithful person. I believe in images." The chief temporal displacement in this film is the transposition of the biblical account of Mary and the virgin birth from the New Testament era to modernity, portraying Mary as a young Swiss woman who works in her father's gas station, plays basketball in her spare time, receives the Annunciation when the angel Gabriel arrives by airplane, and has a taxi-driving boyfriend named Joseph, who has not slept with her and is understandably nonplussed when she tells him she is pregnant. Here again we find a hauntological aesthetic, a spectral mingling of temporalities in which the world of the present and visitations from the past are impossible to disentangle. There are several times of the specter, Derrida writes. It is a proper characteristic of the specter that no one can be sure if by returning it testifies to a living past or to a living future, for the revenant may already mark the promised return of the specter of living being. In the multidimensional Hail Mary, the living past is embedded in the living present, and both point toward a living future when the film concludes with a seemingly unmotivated close-up of Mary's mouth. At first, the mouth is closed, resembling a diagram drawn by a professor in an earlier scene, illustrating his theory that earthly life did not originate through random chemical reactions. The very spuriousness of this notion points away from ordinary logic and toward a conception of science haunted by the mysterious and the mystical. But in the film's last seconds, the mouth is open, recalling earlier moments when Mary or another woman widens her mouth in a gesture of astonishment and delight, the emotions that constitute the film's ultimately triumphant and fundamentally mystical essence. And let's have a brief clip from the very tail end of Hail Mary.
Hé, madame!
Oui? Quoi?
Rien. Je vous salue, Marie.
Moi, je suis de la Vierge. Et je n'ai pas voulu de cet être. J'ai marqué l'âme qui m'a aidée. C'est tout.
The cultural critic Michael Goddard describes mysticism as a set of practices that actualize a prediscursive seeing and hearing, by means of which the spiritual or spirits can be conceived of as virtually inhering in the material world in the form of temporalities, or conversely, the material world can be conceived of as existing in the spiritual or in God in the same way that it exists in time. Hail Mary displaces not only discrete temporalities, but the concept of temporality itself. As I have observed elsewhere, this is cinema that breaks the link between man and the world, to quote Gilles Deleuze, confronting the viewer with something unthinkable in thought. This resonates powerfully with Davis's discussion of the hauntological specter, whose secret is a productive opening of meaning, rather than a determinate content to be uncovered. Much as the secret of the ghost for Derrida is not a puzzle to be solved, but rather the structural openness or address directed towards the living by the voices of the past or the not yet formulated possibilities of the future. The ghost pushes at the boundaries of language and thought. Like established certainties, determinate contents and boundaries of thought are foes Godard never tired of contesting. Godard's magnum opus, Histoire du cinéma, is his most haunted and hauntological work. It doesn't simply allude to the cinematic history that preoccupied his imagination. It resurrects and reconfigures that history through a plethora of favored shots, sequences, and scenes that together constitute a chronologically displaced history of film, and also a stream of consciousness record of Godard's drastically intuitive thinking processes. It also demonstrates his view of video possibilities not yet explored. In my 1994 interview with Godard, he said that television discovers nothing, even though it could, it should. I think I'm the only one interested in film and video this way, to sometimes make a show, but other times an experimentation. Histoire du cinéma shows his double identity as modernist and postmodernist in unfiltered form. As critic Jay Hoberman observes, he is a quintessential 20th century high modernist, the author of an ongoing, not yet completed project comparable in ambition to In Search of Lost Time or The Cantos. Composed in an idiom like that, as with Joyce or Picasso or Gertrude Stein, effectively reinvented a medium. But as the first filmmaker to fully recognize not only that the classic period of movies was over, but also that pre-existing movies were a text that he was free to quote, rework, and otherwise pillage, he may also be considered cinema's first postmodernist, and a model for postmodernists in other disciplines. The film scholar Wheeler Winston-Dixon gets the flavor of Histoire du Cinéma when he states that all is simultaneous, endlessly overlapping, one image and another swirling together to create a hybrid construct which deconstructs original images and adds something new to them. All is context, history, archival research, and speculation. Godard is immersed in his images, which become phantoms haunting our combinatory consciousness. The artifacts that Hoberman calls pre-existing movies are more than that, however. They are what Derrida calls revenants, specters hovering ambiguously between a living past and a living future. The same goes for, I'm sorry, I lost my place here for a moment. Yes, they are what Derrida calls revenants, specters hovering ambiguously between a living past and a living future. The same goes for the sophisticated sonic elements of the work, with music ranging from Gustav Mahler and Giacomo Puccini to Leonard Cohen and Rita Hayworth, and spoken collages that call attention to accent, intonation, diction, vocal color, and the sound of human breath. It is literally true that by returning to what has been forgotten, Histoire du Cinéma does not raise the dead, as one film scholar has written, but Godard's exorbitant montage techniques give the work a, and again I'm quoting from an earlier film scholar, a necromantic prescience by elaborating the historical conditions for the memory of cinema, replacing the supposition of death in the cinema with an expansion of narrative tradition through the new medium of video, a moment where the undead nature of the technology is revealed. The idea of cinematic necromancy is essential to Godard's implicit vision of a cinema forever dying and being reborn, like the supernatural figures at the core of religious belief systems through the ages, and being repeatedly transformed and refashioned in this endlessly cyclical process. Within specific works, the closing title of Weekend proffers the pithiest statement of the death of cinema theme, and Histoire du Cinéma delivers the most extensive elaboration, positing no fewer than 5 such deaths, which have been summarized by Daniel Morgan as the demise of silent cinema, the failure of cinema to record or show the Holocaust, the end of the studio system in the 1950s, the May '68 call for the end of bourgeois cinema, and from the 1970s on, the crisis stemming from newer media technologies. Taken together, Godard's numerous alarums and perturbations bespeak a concern that the history of cinema harbors the phantoms postulated by psychoanalytical hauntology, dead forebears nested in the living ego, bringing corruption and decay that the apparatuses of show business must keep deeply hidden, so the driving powers of blind commercialism and socio-political ignorance won't come shamefully to light. Fears about cinema's dark substructures have been a motivating force throughout Godard's career, from the genre revisions of the 1960s through the puzzles and perplexities of the 2000s. But he was keenly aware that however often an end of cinema seemed imminent, none of its deaths, demises, and dissolutions have been fatal, as the existence of Histoire du Cinéma and a long list of subsequent Godard works amply proves. When he announces the death of cinema, Morgan observes, he generally does so within a film, and with the full intention of making more films. Nor does he seem to want the announcements to be taken all that literally. The death of cinema? Godard remarked in 1984. For me, I say, not at all. That idea has always existed in French cinema. You find artists in 1910 who say that the cinema is in crisis. Histoire du Cinéma is not an obituary then, but a history and a story, as its title plainly indicates. In many contexts, the term history connotes some sort of linear chronology, but Godard obviously has the other meaning of histoire clearly in mind, and stories need rules of straight-ahead recitation less than histories do. Asked if a film should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, Godard famously replied, yes, but not necessarily in that order. This stipulation applies many times over to Histoire du Cinéma, which displaces, dislocates, and discombobulates linear time with a freewheeling abandon that unmistakably evokes the elusive temporality of the hauntological specter. Derrida writes, "What is the time and what is the history of a specter? Is there a present of the specter? Are its comings and goings ordered according to the linear succession of a before and an after, between a present past, a present present and a present future, between a real time and a deferred time? If there is something like spectrality, there are reasons to doubt this reassuring order of presence, and especially the border between the present, the actuality or present actuality of the present, and everything that can be opposed to it: absence, non-presence, non-effectivity, inactuality, virtuality, or even the simulacrum in general, and so forth. There is first of all the doubtful contemporaneity of the present to itself. Before knowing whether one can differentiate between the specter of the past and the specter of the future, of the past present and the future present, one must perhaps ask oneself whether the spectrality effect does not consist in undoing this opposition or even this dialectic between actual effective presence and its other. End of quote. A crucial factor in the spectrality effect of Histoire du Cinéma is its conversion of a teeming succession of film images into a teeming flow of video images. This transfiguration has two crucial outcomes. It de-emphasizes the plastic physicality of the film stock, on which most of the selected materials were photographed, and it places clips from narrative movies onto the same ontological plane as the television images, paintings, photographs, advertisements, spoken narration, and musical accompaniments that are co-equal parts of the mix. This connects Histoire du Cinéma with a pair of well-established artistic practices. One is sampling, which has its own cultural history in diverse forms, including musique concrète, musical instruments such as the chamberlin and mellotron, and the digital borrowings that became a major force in popular music in the 1970s. And the other is appropriation, a timeless modus operandi in art that will surely survive the largely ill-informed attacks often leveled at it nowadays. The hauntological aesthetic, according to Sprod, profits from the anachronisms of samples and appropriations, mainly through the maintenance of the distance from their origin and the decay that occupies that distance, as crackles and scratches or faded colors and images that become almost literally ghostly. Instead of mere repetition, this distance provides a sense of loss and mourning, making the present the future of that past, and in turn providing the possibility of another future for the present. A sense of loss and mourning is indeed detectable in the visual content, first-person narration, and overall tone of Histoire du Cinéma, as it is in less ambitious displays of aging footage compiled by archivists and preservationists, such as Peter Delpeu's Lyrical Nitrate and Bill Morrison's Decasia. These and similar instances of commingled deterioration and preservation evoke the lesson that Jameson finds in spectrality, a recognition that what we take as the dense and solid present is less self-evident and self-sufficient than we would like to think it is. And one final clip, just a little reminder of the general tone of Histoire du Cinéma.
Tout ça pour dire, qu'est-ce qui fait qu'en 40-45, il n'y a pas eu de cinéma de résistance? Non qu'il n'y a pas eu de film de résistance, à droite, à gauche, ici, là. Mais le seul film, au sens de cinéma, qui a résisté à l'occupation du cinéma par l'Amérique, à une certaine manière uniforme de faire le cinéma, ce fut un film italien. Ce n'est pas par hasard. L'Italie était le pays qui s'est le moins battu, qui a beaucoup souffert, mais qui a trahi 2 fois, et qui a donc souffert de ne plus avoir d'identité. Et s'il l'a retrouvé avec Rome ville ouverte, c'est que le film était fait par des gens sans uniforme. C'est la seule fois. Les Russes ont fait des films de martyrs. Les Américains ont fait des films de publicité. Les Anglais en font ce qu'ils font toujours dans le cinéma. Rien. L'Allemagne n'avait pas de cinéma. Plus de cinéma. Et les Français ont fait Sylvie et le fantôme. Les Polonais ont fait 2 films d'expiation. La passagère et la dernière étape. Et un film de souvenir, Canal. Et puis ils ont fini par accueillir Spielberg, lorsque Plus jamais ça est devenu C'est toujours ça. Tandis qu'avec Rome ville ouverte, l'Italie a simplement reconquis le droit pour une nation de se regarder en face. Et alors est venue l'étonnante moisson du grand cinéma italien. Mais il y a une chose étrange cependant. Comment le cinéma italien a-t-il pu devenir si grand, puisque tous, de Rossellini à Visconti, d'Antonioni à Fellini, n'enregistraient pas le son avec les images? Une seule réponse. La langue d'Ovide et Virgile, de Dante et de Leopardi, était passée dans les images.
Okay, do not abandon hope, the end is very near. Yet while it is never difficult to find overtones of loss, mourning, decay, and ghostliness in Histoire du Cinema and other Godard projects, the exuberance, multiplicity, and superabundance of the works lead in exactly the opposite direction. Even as his turn to video implies that the death of film may be at hand, the vibrancy and vigor of the funeral ceremony, or rather the wake, show that the ghosts of cinema have a thrilling life of their own, different in form and structure from their more tangible progenitors, but no less robust and exciting in their impact. Histoire du Cinema is a festival of welcome revenants and lively ghosts, and it is also a far-sighted exploration of how video expression might evolve in time to come. The logic of the ghost, Derrida wrote, points toward a thinking of the event that necessarily exceeds a binary or dialectical logic, transcending the limits of actuality and effectivity in ways exemplified by the fantastic, ghostly, synthetic, prosthetic, virtual happenings in the scientific domain, and therefore the domain of the technomedia, and therefore the public or political domain. The intricate logic of Histoire du Cinema is dialogical rather than dialectical, rhizomatic rather than binary, and all of Derrida's descriptors for scientific, public, and technomedia developments, fantastic, synthetic, virtual, ghostly, readily apply to it. A hauntological account of Godard's achievement in choosing, assembling, and interweaving multitudinous components must also have a place of honor for the word spirit, in the sense that Derrida intends when the spirit of Marxism is under discussion. Spirits in the plural and in the sense of specters, of untimely specters that one must not chase away, but sort out, critique, keep close by, and allow to come back. This calls for a selectivity that will guide and hierarchize the spirits that are chosen, and will also exclude and even annihilate by watching over its ancestors than rather over certain others, thereby engendering new ghosts by choosing already among the ghosts its own from among its own. Godard's towering summa is both a historiography and a meta-historiography that will be reborn and renewed as other cineasts follow in its path. So in the Godardian spirit of dislocated time, I will close by returning to my starting point. Godard was haunted by cinema. Cinema remains haunted by Godard. I am haunted by them both.